Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the Tokyo Champions League top 16 lists. We have 15 of the 16 decks. We're just missing the one Dragapult here. But fortunately, there was another Dragapult that made top 8, so we do have a ton of deck lists to look at. If we want to look at the breakdown, there were 3 Lugia decks in the top 16. 2 Raging Bolt, 2 Regidrago, 2 Charizard, 2 Dragapult, 2 Gardevoir, 2 Iron Thorns, and 1 Palkia. I think the standout here is Iron Thorns. Can't imagine that was a highly played archetype, even though it is a world's winning deck list, but it does show that it still has that power behind it to go deep in these larger scale tournaments. Still a very disruptive archetype, still has a lot going for it with that really frustrating ability. But what this does show is that there is a really diverse pool of archetypes right now that can be succeeding, and that's really intriguing for our Stellar Crown format. We have a number of tournaments in this set, of course, so I think there is going to be ebbs and flows of popularity of these sorts of decks at the top, which is really intriguing. So let's get into some deck lists. The tournament was won by Raging Bolt Ogerpon with the new inclusion of Briar, which pretty much everyone has been putting into the Bolt archetype. It allows you to take a single prize knockout with Bellowing Thunder, provided that you can get a Myriad Leaf Shower 3 prize KO. Not always the easiest unless you're hitting for that crucial weakness into Charizard, so the Briar is somewhat of a Charizard tech inclusion, but every now and then can spring up as well when there's things like Radiant Charizard going into Dragapult and Charizard lists as well. If they want to use a one prizer and you're already on an even map, Briar is basically a boss's orders in that similar case where you can force that single prize Pokemon to become a 2-prizer. Speaking of which, there's Catchers and Prime Catcher as well as the one copy of Boss. Obviously Palpads try and reload these one-off supporters because we are Pokestopping in the list. That's why you see a silly amount of item cards. You've got the Trekking Shoes and the Pokegears to make sure that you're getting that turn 1 Sardas. We're obviously going to choose to go second with Raging Bolt so you can get that initial Bellowing Thunder off and initiate that prize race. With the amount of Gusting in the deck list, it's not too much to ask for to target down a 2-prize Pokemon from the opponent from the get-go, or if they've only got like one of their attacking basic down, you can also try and target that and buy a turn in that regard. Interesting to note the Lost Vacuum tech inclusion, definitely good against Gardevoir. I think Briar plus Vacuum actually makes Raging Bolt much better into Gardevoir, much closer than it was previously. Again, Ogerpon can easily deal with like a damaged Scream Tail or Drifloon or something like that, so that's also a matchup that's definitely improving for Raging Bolt. But as we know, Vacuum is such a versatile card, it can come up in all sorts of situations right now. I think the only real things to take away from this deck list is it's choosing to play no Ultra Ball and instead has that high Night Stretcher count. Many archetypes have started to employ the Pokestop high stretcher combo, oftentimes even with stage 2s, but it looks like Raging Bolt gets by just fine by having the very high Night Stretcher count, going a little bit lower on the energy retrieval and superior split, but it really comes down to the versatility of Night Stretcher within the list. Second place was a Lugia archetype. It does have a 3-2 Chinchino counts, and it has the 1 Nest Ball snuck in there, but still having 2 Great Ball. Only 1 Stadium Bounce in the deck list for that Temple of Sinnoh, which is a little bit scary for me. There's also the very cheeky Counter Catcher coming into the deck. Really hard to try and make this come off. Has to be in the hand at the right times, but it is obviously a Power Spike card that a number of archetypes take advantage of. There's also no Squawkabilly or Carmine, so maybe a little bit less turbo of other Lugias we've seen as of late, but it is including the really sneaky Thornton in the deck list to switch up a basic Pokemon with another one, so you can get a surprise Chinchino out of nowhere, for example. And equally, it means that if you're trying to make defensive plays, benching double Lugia proactively against maybe an aggressive archetype and it turns out that they can't get a KO or whatever else, you can still Thornton into a 1-prizer later. In top 4 was Shizuya Yamamoto, a really impressive player. They've already got a first place Champions League finish and a top 8 finish with Lost Zone variants, and now another top 4. Absolutely insane how consistent they've been at these monster scale tournaments over the last couple of seasons. And they're going with that Charizard Pidgeot with the Dusknoir package. There are some interesting inclusions in here right now. First of all, the stadium choice of Jamming Tower over Temple of Sinnoh or Collapse Stadium, which is usually the go-to option. Also choosing to play TM Devolution, possibly somewhat of a mirror tech card, also can come up against Dragapult as well. And you can get Trixie with Dusknoir, of course, if you're just going for like a Burning Darkness punch into something, then you can put Curse Blast and Devolve all at once. It can allow some really cool lines. Naturally, we see the Briar inclusion in the deck, also the Thornton, which is much more commonplace in Charizard these days. A pretty high Iono count as well as the Roxanne in the deck list. Maybe this is a nod that there's a prime catcher in the deck list rather than an unfair stamp, and go for that higher sort of raw supporter count just to make sure you're constantly putting the opponent still down to the lower hand size. There's also the Mist Energy in the deck list. This might be a nod to, again, devolving strategies similar to the Jamming Tower, but also can protect you a little bit more against the Dragapult matchup. So I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing DTE out, Mist Energy into a number of these Charizard lists as well. The top 4 Regidrago list is also a really standard one, to be honest with you. Not too much standing out here. There's no Goodra in the deck list. It's having both Temple and Jamming Tower, which we have seen of late, but it is also shoving in the Cancelling Clone once again, which was a bit of debate in the last few tournaments for some players. Just the 3 copies of Earthen Vessel, despite it being like one of the most powerful cards in the deck list, but that's to have a slightly elevated support account with the 3rd copy of Iono, as well as 1 copy of Penny in the deck list, which actually also shows up in the top 16 Drago as well, so there might be something to this inclusion. And very quickly then, just jumping down to the other top 8 Drago, where I think there's a switch incorporated into the deck list rather than a Temple of Sinnoh. That's it. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same 60. The one newcomer archetype to make top 16 is the Palkia Noctowl with the Terapagos. Really interesting deck list as well, where it's got the 1 Fan Rotom, but also a 2/2 Bibarel line, as well as the Nestash Squovit to sort of supplement the early Jewel Seeker options that you have. You kind of have a mid to late game draw engine with Bibarel Squovit. When Palkia goes first, it can be devastating with that Moonlight Shuriken combination. That's been true of Palkia since its release, and now with Jewel Seeker, you can combine the Prime Catcher Cologne even more consistently than ever before. This deck's also found a way to wiggle in the Briar supporter, because of course you can attack with Terapagos and actually burst it out in 1 turn with the help of Glass Trumpet plus turn attachments, or if you've done some Palkia shenanigans, there's also an energy switch within the deck list. This isn't just to get Terapagos swinging, of course, it can also allow you to get an Articuno out of nowhere for paralysis plays, which I think is really interesting into the likes of Charizard and Dragapult, these matchups where you don't really have that reach in the list. Having a paralysis option could be really handy, but also it can allow you to chain that Moonlight Shuriken attack as well if you are able to get a snipe off and then the Greninja isn't dealt with. Either the opponent's gone for a 2-prize Pokemon elsewhere on your board, or they simply can't manifest an attack. Having a turn attachment plus energy switch combo to get Greninja back into the action can also be pretty devastating. The top 8 Raging Bolt list wasn't too different either. It cut one of the catchers for an Iron Bundle option. It was choosing not to play the Briar, which is kind of interesting, but did include a couple copies of the Bravery Charm, definitely a solid card against the Dragapult matchup, and can come in as an annoyance against things like Charizard as well, forcing those extra pieces from the opponent. In the last list, we saw that elevated count of Night Stretcher, but in this list, it's 2 Retrieval, 1 Rod, and 1 Night Stretcher, so a completely different combination of your resource recovery options. The final top 8 list was a Dragapult Pidgeot build, choosing not to play Dusknoir or Briar either, just going for the Radiant Alakazam option, the new cards being the Crispin and Sparkling Crystal options. The Crystal is just so insane with Arven, which you're obviously playing 4 of in the deck list. In terms of disruption, there are the 2 copies of Countercatcher to go alongside your 2 Iono and Roxanne, as well as the League Headquarters, which I definitely think is a nod to the Raging Bolt matchup, where you're trying to make it difficult for them to chain their attacks turn by turn. I do find it really interesting that the Japanese players do seem to tend towards having Roxanne split in with their Ionos, whereas in the West it seems like we're much more commonly just playing the extra copy of Iono in the likes of Charizard and Dragapult. It's a +1, like, good supporter in the opening turns if you've gone second, which I always think is reasonable, but of course Roxanne's a great quick search option in that sort of mid-game where you can make sure you sit on a strong hand, having Fez and Recon Directive to sort of fall back on as well in the latter stages of the game to make sure that you can close it out. There were 2 top 16 Lugias, both actually quite different as well. This one's incorporating 1 copy of Klefki, which I do think is a real nuisance in the format right now. Definitely can improve your time into some of the aggressive archetypes. This list is also choosing to play that Weirdeer to supplement the 2/2 line of Chinchino, and it's going for the 2 copies of Jamming Tower in the deck list rather than the Mezagoza to add some extra disruption, and possibly for some removal of annoying Bravery Charms. The other top 16 list was also playing the Klefki, also the Wellspring Ogerpon, which is quite popular actually out in Japan, choosing to play the Carmine in the deck list. I actually played 1 copy of the Dusk Ball, which is a new item card that we won't have access to, but it's essentially a Great Ball that's from the bottom of the deck. And I guess the cool thing about this card is if you've been Iono'd, you can do it with like a guarantee that you can get a Pokemon that was in your previous hand, so that can be a little bit interesting. But at the end of the day, it's just a Great Ball that takes you longer to play, to be honest with you. There were 2 Gardevoirs both in the top 16. This list is double Monkey Dory, 3 Darkness Energy, has all those disruptive options with the double TM TM devolution, definitely respecting the Charizard matchup. This is really looking like an NAIC or World Style 60 that we've come to know over the last few sets. The other top 16 lists, not quite as crazy on the Monkey Dory shenanigans, does have that second copy of Bravery Charm instead, to possibly get a bit more aggressive with the likes of Screamtail and Drifloon. Also chose to include the Cresselia as a different attacking threat, but ultimately sticking with the same core concept. The other top 16 Charizard list was also playing the Dusknoir Briar package. It seems too good to not play by the looks of things. Also chose to play the TM Devolution, which is quite scary for the amount of evolution decks in the format. Had its own copy of Mist Energy, but also had the double Turbo Energy in the 60 as well. In this case, it was the unfair Stamp A-Spec chosen over the Prime Catcher. And we also really interestingly see 3 copies of Buddy Poffin, 3 Nestball, but then 2 copies of the Rotom. I'm surprised to see this over just an extra copy of either of these Ball Search cards, or even Hisuian Heavy Ball in the list as well. And then we actually do have both Iron Thorns lists, just one of them on Limitless right now, but the other one is currently on Pokeca book. So this is, again, similar to the World 60 in that it's incorporating the Lost Cities into the deck list, the Catcher's flips, as well as the Crushing Hammer flips in the deck, and Prime Catcher being that A-Spec of choice. I think you really always go Prime Catcher now, especially with Briar in the format, because that will negate the effectiveness of a Legacy, and just tracking down certain Pokemon is more important. Yeah, not too much to say about the Iron Thorns. We know what it does at this point, and it's still getting the job done pretty capably. The other top 16 list was actually wild in comparison, where it's choosing to play none of the Chorus's Tenacity and just goes for the 4 Energy Lotto, with the upside being that you can play the Eerie Supporter in a 3 count in the deck list to try and trap the opponent's hand and buy turns for yourself to just swing away with the Iron Thorns EX. Really creative list, choosing not to play the catchers, of course, and instead going for some guaranteed disruption via the supporter card. An interesting direction to take the list, I think. Overall, it's a really diverse top 16, which I think bodes well for the format that we're going into. 3 different Stage 2s managed to see success. 3 different V-Stars also managed to do well, and there are the basic attackers in the mix as well. And it seems like Iron Thorns came out on top as the disruptive deck of choice over any controlling options. What do you think about the top 16? Where was Terapagos? Do you think Palkia's real? And which of these lists are you going to be taking to your next tournament? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.